Hello, everyone. This is Ed Bruniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Virginia Summey, who is an historian. I met her in a coffee shop a couple of weeks ago, and we had a nice initial chat. And I think we have a lot of things in common that we're going to talk about today, even though I don't know what we're going to talk about, which is the fun thing. So, welcome, Virginia. Tell us a
Thank
little
you for
bit about
having me.
yourself and where your interests are.
Yeah. Oh, well, I was born and raised in Western North Carolina. I think we talked about the other day. I'm originally from Rutherford County. My dad was from Forest
First
City,
City, yeah, uh-huh.
Forest City.
I know it well.
Yeah. And then he was a United Methodist minister, and so we moved all around Western North Carolina. So it's very much home. I moved away for a little while, but it's where I'm happy to be living and raising my children and working as a historian.
Your husband is a Summey, right?
No, I am a Summie. My
You're the
husband's
Summey. And
yeah.
and so there are all
my-
these Summeys up in Western North Carolina. So are you connected all to them?
At least the Rutherford County Summies. So I think there's some Rutherford County Summies and some Lincoln County Summies. I think we're probably all connected way back when through the Great Wagon Road somehow.
Yeah. Well,
But yeah,
there's some in Buncombe County too.
yes, there are. Yes. So no, my husband's last name is Aby, and his he grew up in Greensboro, but they're originally from the Hickory area.
That's great. All those Piedmont Carolina names. Yeah.
Yes.
It's it's really true. And that the history of Piedmont, North Carolina, and reaching down into South Carolina. It's very interesting history, and you're a part of that. I'm a part of that, and I don't know if that's what we should talk about, but maybe we'll get to that.
Yeah,
Um, you are you're a holder of a PhD in history, correct?
correct. Yes.
So, what did you study in your PhD?
My PhD specifically in United States history. I received that in 2017 from UNC-Greensboro. And I studied basically my area of expertise is post-1865 South, particularly legal and political history. So I do a lot of research into civil rights and women's movements. The book I wrote, which had its first iteration was my dissertation, was on a woman. Her name was Judge Elreta Melton Alexander. And she was from Greensboro, but she was the first Black woman to graduate from Columbia Law School in 1945. And she moves back home to Greensboro and becomes a successful attorney and judge, the first elected judge in the Black female elected judge in the country. And she did all this during the civil rights movement. And so I kind of insert her in Greensboro's civil rights movement and add some complexity to that story, add a voice and a name that deserves recognition, and yet at that, so far, at the time I wrote the book, had not received what I thought was enough recognition for her accomplishments. So that is a lot of the research I do academically. And then, of course, I work as a historical consultant as well, which gives me the opportunity to really dive into histories that I wouldn't have the opportunity to dive into otherwise, which is a lot of fun.
I think the history of Black women in the
Mhm.
South is underdeveloped.
Absolutely.
I took when I went to Chapel Hill, was an American Studies major, and I took two courses in African American literature.
Mhm.
And I loved it. It was great. And not only did I see where the conflicts are, but I also saw where the commonalities were.
Mhm.
And we read a number of women writers. I can't pull them out of the top of my head at this moment, but we read a number of women writers, and it was really great. I mean, it was like um, something whole. You're getting a whole picture of who people are. But it seems like other than Rosa Parks, we don't really hear much about who the women are who were in the civil rights movement.
Exactly. One of the books that inspired me the most in writing my book was a biography of Ella Baker, which is behind me somewhere. Um, but just, how, a woman like it was Ella Baker in the Black Freedom Movement, but just how a woman who was literally in a major part of every major civil rights organization in the mid 20th century. And she had kind of been relegated to a supporting role when really she was a primary character.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I gather, and you know, I've I've had relationships with African Americans in all of my life since high school. I mean, really since high school, and and that's that little hole there that's kind of not very well developed and um, probably needs some more of.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, I started doing more African American history when I was a master's student at the University of Montana. Interestingly enough, the University of Montana has the third oldest African American studies program in the country. And so I was fortunate enough to, when I was there, to work with a professor. His name is Tobin Miller Shear, and he's just, absolutely wonderful. And I was learning more about the Black history of North Carolina sitting in a classroom in Missoula, Montana, than I ever had growing up in North Carolina.
That's amazing. I didn't realize that. Um, University of Montana is an interesting place. One of the top philosophers of the late 20th century was there. He's no longer alive, but Albert Boardman and
Oh,
I used to live out in Wyoming, and I went to see
right.
Albert. I wrote him and said, "Hey, I'm coming to Missoula. I'd like to spend some time with you." And we had some time. I think back in around must have been around 2010, 2012, somewhere in there. And but yeah,
Wow.
it's a unique place in the West.
It is. It is. I love it very much. We'll be out there a little bit this summer, and
Excellent.
um, we try to get out there. My family loves it out there. It's very much our, home away from home.
So I'm asking questions based on my own history. So when I spent several years working at a small college in West Virginia, Davis and Alcott College, and one of the things I got to do there was to teach in the history department. And with one of the history professors, we team taught a class in religion and history, religion and politics in the South, which was a lot of fun. And then I taught a 2 semester class of Western civilization, which was very, very tough. I mean, it was a tough, but, and what I found was that uh, these kids coming out of high school were not very well versed in history at any level. And I'm wondering how, I mean, you're teaching some now. How do you address that? How do you enter into a classroom where you have all this knowledge and you want to, in a sense, impart that knowledge, and yet you know that these students are not prepared to receive it yet?
Right. I think teaching history right now is particularly interesting. Um, and I feel like particularly my students at Salem College are they have a little bit more of an age range and diversity. And so I feel like a lot of them are very prepared to receive a lot of the information. And they seem to be and I'm going to brag on the
Please
women
do.
of Salem College. They
My mother's
have
alma
just
mater.
yeah, they're just absolutely wonderful and so open and to learning about U.S. and even and I try to incorporate as much North Carolina history in the U.S. history as possible. But just yesterday in my African American history class, we were talking about the 1898 coup d'etat in Wilmington. And they were just kind of enraptured by the conversation because they didn't know about it very much. They had heard, oh, yeah, there was something that happened in Wilmington a long time ago. And so, being able to hear the details of that, they were so involved in the discussion and in the lecture. And so it definitely, as a professor, as a teacher, was exciting for me to be able to teach them something, a part of, not just an integral part of not just North Carolina history, but of American history, and have it be so well received, as particularly given it's such a, horribly violent and brutal event. But yeah, it was nice as a as a professor.
Well, you're sparking in them an interest in something that's new to them, and
Right.
maybe they pursue it. Maybe they decide, oh, I want to study this at a deeper
Yeah.
level, and they go on to graduate school and they study it like you did.
Yeah. I took 6 years off in between my bachelor's and my master's degree. But yeah, I hope so. I definitely have set students who are talking about going to graduate school, which is, of course, very exciting.
Where did you go to undergraduate school?
I went to Catawba College in Salisbury, North
Uh-huh.
Carolina. I was a political science major. So I studied under Michael Bitzer, who is still at Catawba, and you've probably seen him. I heard him on NPR just this morning, uh, talking
I
about
know
the
him, yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And so I absolutely loved it there. I ended up minoring in history. I believe I'm a Spanish credit short of a double major in political science and history. But I just absolutely loved Catawba. It was the right place for me at that point in my life, and the small liberal arts college is of course, near and dear to my heart. And I love teaching in that environment as well.
And do you remember from those years a specific area of history that kind of emerged as, oh, I really didn't know that. Oh, this is really interesting. Something where you kind of had this epiphany about, so this is what this is all about.
Yeah. It was probably a class I took. It was called, I think it was called Politics Southern Style, but it was basically a Southern political history class. And I still have, the VO key book on my shelf back there. I think I have several sh books from that class on my shelf behind me. And that was really kind of helped to solidify that I knew I thought I was going to be working in politics, but ending up teaching and researching political history is really, that is where that passion began.
What was the time frame of that course?
It was post-Civil War to kind of mid 20th, well, post-Civil War to, yeah, 20th
And
century.
and what I mean, I think that's an interesting period of time. Um,
Yeah.
Not only the era of Reconstruction, but also Jim Crow and the Golden Age, and all those things that were going on both locally and but nationally as well. Let's kind of capture that in terms of how did what was going on, say post Civil War, so between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, how does that have an effect upon us today?
Wow. Well, I mean, after, and I was just talking about this with my students yesterday,
Excellent.
after United States troops pulled out of the South after, at the end of Reconstruction, you had, the group of redeemers that came in and it firmly established, this lost cause ideology. And just told my students yesterday, groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy were extraordinarily successful, not just in making sure there was a monument in every, small town, downtown, in the South, but in uh, dictating or changing how textbooks were written, which my parents grew up, in the South in the, 1950s and early 1960s. And these were the textbooks that they were reading, that portrayed the Civil War as a righteous cause and that the South had, was ordained by God. And so it's so contemporary now. It was just, a few years ago that I wrote an op-ed about, why it was time for the Confederate monument in downtown Salisbury to come down. And so these are still issues and ideas that, as we just talked, my mom is, sorry, mom, my mom's in her mid 70s. And so, these are still very much the ideas that still exist. And this was all kind of, solidified in that post-Reconstruction era in the South. And so yeah, so it's very interesting, and we're still, like I said, we're still dealing with um the fallout or ramifications of that.
It was interesting growing up in Winston-Salem in the the middle of the 20th century, and going through my entire scholastic education in all white schools,
Hmm. Hmm.
and not coming out of that with a sense of anything other than curiosity about what the situation was, and realizing that um, having and then go, spending 4 years at Chapel Hill, and coming away from that realizing that the situation is far more complex than we want to allow it to be,
Hmm.
and the people who are kind of in control of the narratives, whether on the right or the left, have a kind of a commitment to making things overly simplified so that they kind of maintain their position of leverage over everybody else. And
Right.
what I found is that the more I interact with people, the more I have a clearer sense of what actually was going on. And
Hmm.
so, and I'm leading to a point here. Um, One of the things that was really clear to me growing up in Winston-Salem was that there was this huge racial division between whites and blacks, and it was divided by US 52. And you
Hmm.
had all the white people in the industries west of 52 and all the suburbs, all the white suburbs. And then you had East Winston where most of the African Americans lived. And
Hmm.
it was very obvious that that was the way it was. And for whatever reason, that's the way it was. I had a football coach at Mount Tabor, a black man, my last year, who invited us into his home. He invited his players into his home. And we would go out. We go to East Winston, sit on the front porch, drink tea, and talk. And we're not blacks and whites together. We were just people together. And
Hmm.
and watching how he handled things, it was interesting in contrast to the way a few years prior to that, there had been this race riot here in Winston-Salem.
Right.
And so I have these two competing things. Then I go off to Chapel Hill the next year. I'm sitting in my freshman English class up on the second floor of Peabody Hall, and a civil rights march walks by, and I'm thinking, how curious is that?
Yeah.
So I felt like growing up in this environment, I didn't have a position or perspective that had been kind of imposed upon me. There was this kind of openness to explore whatever it was. And the more interaction I had with African Americans, the clearer it became that there was a whole lot of things that were common and that they suffered in ways that also many white people had suffered as well. And yet that didn't serve the way the conflict was portrayed in the way the world was operating. And so I just throw that in because what I see is that the more we have interaction with one another, the more we have ways of actually interpreting what the history is to our lives. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry.
go ahead. I mean, yeah, you have something to say.
Oh, no, no, no. We were just, as I said, and how these residential segregation patterns emerged, and even why Highway 52 is where Highway 52 is, all have these, unique stories.
And a lot of people, it was, I guess the other thing to say is that all these decisions were made by a very small group of people.
Yes.
And
Yes.
they were dictating to all the rest of us, and I wasn't one of them. And but I remember the race riot. I think it was 67. My father was on the there was a local group, I forget what the name of it was, but he was called in to become part of the solution to how do we going to quell this riot.
Mhm.
Human Relations Council is what he was on. And, I was proud of him that he was a part of that. And to me, it was really interesting to kind of watch all this thing transpire. Winston's just one city. You had the same sort of things going on in Greensboro and in Charlotte and
Absolutely.
all over the South. And I think I think as we get older and new generations come along, I mean, you're a different generation from me, obviously, that we have a chance to see things in a new way and to have a more progressive way of looking at the world than maybe it was when my grandparents were alive
Right. Right.
years ago. So,
Absolutely. Yes.
so so you're teaching at Salem, and what courses are you teaching?
Right now I'm teaching I teach US 1 and 2, so pre-1865, post-1865. And then I've taught US women's history and African American history. So all of those being kind of my wheelhouse. Um,
So, when does uh, when does U.S. History One start?
I, I start with contact. Well, I do a lecture on pre-contact, and say, we're covering this much length of period in the first week of class, and then the rest of the class we're going to be covering like this much
Yeah.
period of time. But so I start, pre-contact the Saras, the Catawbans who were here in this area, and Spanish explorers that came up and made contact and outside of what now is Morganton. And so yeah,
Have
I
you
try to take it back as far as I can.
um, I've been interested in all this for a long time, and I went through a season when I moved to Wyoming that I was reading about Western history, and I thought one of the most fascinating stories was of Cabeza de Vaca. Do you know that name?
I know the name. I'm not familiar. I don't know
He
the
was
whole
part of
narrative.
one of the Spanish expeditions. Sorry,
Yeah.
and like Balboa. It was Balboa's one of
Mhm.
Balboa's, and they come around the end of Florida, and they're coming up the west coast of Florida, and somewhere around Tampa Bay, they send a group of them off to go explore up through what is known as Central Florida, and they were going to meet them up there at somewhere around the Alabama, central northern Florida coast. and they go up there and they're exploring, and they never get together, and so they don't meet, and so this small band of explorers, they create some ships, and they go and they sail through the Gulf of Mexico down to somewhere where it would Galveston would be. So they end up in Texas, and they start, okay, what are we going to do? So they start going west. So Texas is different than Florida, it's certainly different than Alabama, and they come across an indigenous tribe that takes them into captivity, and Devaka um, decides he's going to become their shaman, their medicine man, because he reasons that he's going to be able to um, survive this, because as it ends up, most of the people in the expedition are killed. So he ends up escaping, and he goes all the way over into New Mexico, where some expedition coming up from Mexico finds him, and it's just this fantastic story, you know.
Yeah.
And that's what,
Yeah.
that's part of why I love American history is you have these stories of exploration that and Lewis and Clark is one of those. I'm a
Exactly.
Lewis and Clark fan.
I spent, many years living in Lewis and Clark County in Helena, Montana. And yes, and reading about, that expedition. And then I'd look off my front porch and be like, oh, okay, there
Yeah.
it is.
Um,
But yes.
yeah. So I mean, we're 20 years past the um 200th anniversary. It's hard to believe
Yeah.
it's been 20 years since
I know.
celebration of the bicentennial of the journey. Um, what do you think that expedition fits in the history of U.S. today, as we understand the U.S. today? Is it as important maybe it was seen 20 years ago, or 100 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and granted, this is not my area of expertise right now. But no, I mean, but when we talk about the development of the United States West, those areas, Wyoming, Montana, but also, how it was developed, but the fact also, and this goes back to, when I'm teaching US one, how far back do I go? That, in the late 19th century, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote his, frontier thesis about,
Yep.
the West being this kind of open space for the taking, when really there was such a rich diversity of languages and nations and cultures and traditions that had been there, thousands and thousands of years before Lewis and Clark. And particularly as we see, um, not to get too political, but increasingly as we see, maybe certain things taken down from, websites taken down honoring, certain people, certain groups of people, it's definitely more important than ever to, remember that, that there were these amazing, people and nations and languages out there long before Europeans ever, dreamed of setting foot in that area. And that's one of my favorite things about, particularly when I'm out there, is kind of, imagining that land prior, when it was just, when it was, pure and it's such a stunning landscape out there as well. You know, but yeah, keeping those stories in mind. And so in that way, yeah, the story of Lewis and Clark is, yeah, incredibly relevant. Yeah.
I believe it is too. And someday I've got a sketch of a book I'm going to write on it, because I think it's from a standpoint of the leadership of the expedition. But the thing which there are things about that story which I think are indicative of how we look at history,
Mhm.
and we tend to ignore the parts which seemingly are not very interesting to us. So the Indian culture, for example, I think is really
Mhm.
fascinating, and I think that what we ignore is, particularly as white Easterners more than anything, is that there was a great deal of conflict between these tribes of Indians, and
Absolutely.
we don't address that at all. And really,
Absolutely no. That yeah, the indigenous landscape was, certainly not a monolith. It was incredibly diverse, and yes, and and they didn't always get along, absolutely.
and maybe the reason why we were so successful is that we had better technology than they did.
Well, yes, absolutely. The ability
Which is
to
a historic thing.
navigate the Missouri.
Yeah, it's such an interesting place. I've been on almost all of the trail, and the only place
Wow.
I haven't been on is up in North Dakota, up in Bismarck, and it's really interesting. It's you get maybe this is a way to talk about this is that when you're out west and you've lived in Montana, so and you've been close to one of the greatest wilderness areas there,
Mhm.
just east of Missoula, there between there and Helena. The Bob was it the Bob Thompson wilderness area?
Bob Marshall.
Bob Marshall, yes, I knew it was Bob. I knew it was Bob.
Bob.
Bob's wilderness area. Um, but what I take from that is a sense of humility that
Mhm.
that the geography of the West is not going to allow for people who are very arrogant to walk in and say, "Oh, I got this," and we can just do with it whatever we want to do. And I don't think
Right.
that's really true. And I think the people who say in where we live here in Piedmont, North Carolina, who um, say pre-Second World War, who were subsistence farmers, also had a same sense of that. They're very conscious of the land and of what they were dealing with. And how fragile and fragile their life was, which I think is a
Absolutely.
really healthy way to look at the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I love teaching stories about, homesteaders, even though there's a very complicated history behind that and, stories of displacement, but also the fortitude of those people going to this landscape that is very unforgiving, that is, quite brutal. Walking, I mean, I'm just thinking about, walking to in between classes when I'm in grad school and it's, negative 10 degrees out. And, and your nose hairs are freezing. But yeah, but living in that landscape without modern conveniences. I mean, it's intense.
So one of the big themes about Southern history is the
Mhm.
industrialization of the South after the Second World War, I mean after the Civil War, and how that changed the South. Um, and how do you look at that? When you talk to your students about what has transpired in the last 160 years, what is it that how do you talk about this period of time in the South and its development? Do you have any
Yeah.
kind of specifics that are helpful for us?
Yeah, so I'm particularly talking about that development, and I do it, around the time of the Gilded Age, when you had, of course, there weren't the Carnegies and Rockefellers on that magnitude, in the South necessarily, but, you know, Greensboro had the Cone family, which was its own kind of Gilded Age family that, single-handedly developed, not single-handedly, but close, developed the textile industry in the South. And here in Winston-Salem, R.J. Reynolds at the tail end of that era. And so talking about kind of these patterns, but also, where they got their labor from between the textile and the tobacco industries was drastically different. But trying to make kind of these bigger stories, relevant, to North Carolina students and saying, this happened on a smaller scale, right here in Winston-Salem and in the Triad. And also, the communities that we created, talking about, East Winston, the creation of communities like Reynoldstown or the mill communities in Greensboro, that, shape our landscape today. But yeah, so that's kind of how I try to, take it big and then kind of bring it down for them, to, to downtown Winston.
Well, I guess then we would, I mean, I think North Carolina is one of those fascinating states in the country. It's so diverse. I mean, I call it the California of the East, because it's so diverse. I mean,
Yes.
you got the mountain region, you got the Piedmont region, you got the sand hills and the coastal region. And what I see is people from outside see it all as kind of one thing, oh, it's just this or whatever their perception is. But if you look at Winston-Salem and Greensboro, Charlotte, Raleigh, Fayetteville, and Wilmington, and you take those five cities and you say, what is it that links them together other than
Yeah.
they're all geographically connected, but they really are all five very different places.
Very. Yes. The I spent several years when I was at UNCG. I taught a class on Greensboro history and the development, and I've been fortunate enough to work on some of Winston-Salem history with consulting work. And so how these two different cities developed are so drastically different. Winston-Salem, of course, was two different towns, but versus Greensboro and how the industries differed, how even, the settlement patterns differed. Yeah, it's really interesting how, 28 miles made, such a difference in kind of the city's unique origin stories.
Well, let me ask you this, because when I finished at Chapel Hill, I moved to Greensboro and spent 3 years in Greensboro, and I found it a very different place in Winston. I really liked it a lot. And when I would ask people, how is Greensboro different than Winston-Salem? They would say, well, Winston-Salem is a city of very wealthy people and very poor people, and that Greensboro is a city of the middle class.
Hmm.
And I thought, really? I mean, I didn't quite see how that was an accurate depiction, because right, they had the mills there. They have that there was no middle class to speak of 70 years ago. During the
Right.
Second World War, there really wasn't much middle class in the South. Am I
No,
correct in
yeah.
that? Am I correct in that?
Yeah. But and, and how the development and the GI Bill kind of created, for at least for white people, created,
Right.
the middle class that we have today. Of course, we now know that, many black soldiers returning from World War II were not able to access the benefits of the GI Bill. And so but yes, for certain groups of soldiers, were able to come home and create this middle class lifestyle. And particularly, the suburbs and the creation of the Eisenhower interstate system, and they're able to, build, not the mansions that you have in, say Reynolds Park, but, the more middle class homes that you have, out towards, places like Clemens. Um, and so, yeah, we kind of can attribute a lot of that to, the post-war era.
Do you think it's time? I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was at Chapel Hill, and there were historians at Chapel Hill who were lionized as the great men of history. in writing the history of the state of North Carolina. And
George
I
Tyndall.
have those books somewhere in my library. But it seems to me that maybe the time is right to write a new history of the state, which allows the complexity of the state to be much more featured in the way it's written.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I would definitely be willing to contribute to that. But yeah, certainly. And there are so many amazing North Carolina historians out there, telling different stories about, the history of our state. And of course, being a Western North Carolinian, I know much more of those stories than I do at Eastern, North Carolina. But yeah, the diversity in North Carolina calls for, yeah, many new stories to be written about it.
So let me ask you this. I obviously have a lot of questions, also a lot of opinions, but is the history of North Carolina, say from the colonial era all the way to today,
Mhm.
a product of the fact that it was not a plantation culture in its founding?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think because that certainly influenced the way the state was, developed, particularly in the antebellum period.
Mhm.
Um, and because particularly, in the western half of the state, you didn't have the plantation culture. That doesn't mean you didn't have, slavery, but yeah, so you didn't have these, you know, you had very few, of these, sweeping plantations.
Wasn't
Um,
Virginia or South Carolina in that regard.
right, right. There's no, like not like a big Tara in Eastern North Carolina. And so, yeah, absolutely. But it also, one of the things I remember learning very early as a young North Carolinian is kind of the duality of North Carolina. The differences between the East and the West, all the way down to, different accents. And how, you kind of always had that, I don't want to say tension within the state, but certainly, drastically different settlement patterns and patterns of economic development.
When I lived in Hendersonville and Asheville for 20 years, and I had some relationship to UNC Asheville. I taught some history, some literature, excuse me, some leadership classes there. And one of the guys I met one of the students there, and he was a history major, and he's now a school teacher up in Stokes County. And he was an honors scholar. I think he was an honors scholar, but he was one of the ones selected to present his senior paper. And
Hmm.
and his senior paper was on how barbecue defines politics in North Carolina. And it was really
Hmm.
brilliant. It was really brilliant because
Yeah.
barbecue styles are very regional in the state of North Carolina.
Yes. Yes.
And and I still have that copy his of his paper. And I saw him a couple of years ago, and I said, "I still have that." He says, "You do? I don't have a copy. Can I get a copy from you?" You know, I think there are things that are so cultural that they come to define who we are as North Carolinians. And just talking with you about this just fills me a great sense of happiness with having grown up in this state, even if I've lived all over the world, all over this North, all over North Carolina, all over North America. But there's something about this place that is a is um is in my bones, as they say.
Yes. Absolutely. And that's funny. Gary Freeze at Catawba College would teach settlement patterns via barbecue. And I have done that as well.
I'd love to see that
Between,
because
yeah, you have to know to understand how North Carolina is settled between English and, Scots, Irish, and Germans, you have to know the differences between Eastern and Western North Carolina barbecue. And so
I have German
it's
and Scottish ancestry in the state of
Mhm.
North Carolina. My
Mhm.
mother's my I mean, this is the way we get at this. My mother's mother was Moravians. They came from Moravia to Salem, and then they some of them ended up in Texas, and then they in that and so they ended up in Texas. Her father's family were were Scottish. They were Morrisons that had migrated in the 1750s from Scotland to eventually Cabarrus County down the Rocky River community.
Yeah.
And they were three brothers that came, and there are two sisters down there. I think they're still alive, who have written these large volumes of the genealogy. So my mother's family is German and Scottish. My father's family is German and I think English. Not quite sure about his mother, but his family migrated into in the 1730s down into this area. So it was the old Rowan County before it split into Rowan and Davie County. And his family was
Right.
in Davie County, but there are Brennigers all over the kind of the five county region over here, Northwest North Carolina. And and so they were, so these two families were within 50 miles of each other for 200 years and never had
Right.
any
Right.
encounter with them until my mother and my father met. When my father returned home from finishing at Chapel Hill in 1949, and my mother was in school at Salem, and they met and they fell in love and eventually got married. And so I look at that kind of that large scope of migration from Europe that came here, and then it took just two people coming together to bring those two large migration patterns into one family.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, yeah, it's really fascinating. My like I said, I'm originally from Rutherford County. I don't know how many generations back. And my mom is originally from East Tennessee, in the Morristown area.
Uh-huh.
And so, just these two families on opposite sides of the Appalachians and
Well, what I've been learning is that there is a lot of people didn't just move here and stay. They moved out, they went out other places, and they returned. It was a lot of this movement. Um, and it's really fascinating. And I think you'll appreciate this story. Up on the Parkway is the Dalton Park. You know what Dalton Park is up on the and there is a cabin there called the Brenniger Cabin, and
oh.
that's they're cousins of mine, about four or five generations back. I think once removed. I've been trying to
Mhm.
figure that out, and I've been going up there for a long time. And they have a Brenniger Cabin Day every year, usually in September. And it must have been um, maybe 2021, or maybe it was 20, sometime 5 or 6 years ago. I go to Brenniger Cabin Day, and there's this guy there named, um, now I'm blanking on his name, but he's a Kraus. Now, the Brenniger Cabin is Brenniger, the male of the family is Brenniger, but he moved up from down at the bottom of the mountain, down in um, in Wilkes County. He moved up and he married a Kraus who was from Air Bellows Gap, and so this guy is a Kraus, and
Mhm.
we're talking, and so here we have the Brennigers and the Krauses coming together 4 or 5 generations later, and he says,
Yeah.
"Would you like to see where they were buried?" And so I
Yeah.
jump in his car and we take off and we go up the road and we go under the bridge and we come to this little cemetery. And he starts telling me about the Krauses and the Brennigers that were up there. And the kind of the progenitor of this family is Henderson Krause, and he's pre-Civil War, so this is antebellum mountain culture. I mean, a long time ago, and it turns out that they had a black family that lived with them. They weren't slaves, they weren't owned, they were residents of Arabella's Gap, just like the Krauses were. And he would do things with these folks. And there was one of the kids in this family was 7 or 8 years old, and he had this kid take maybe he's 11 or 12 years old. He'd take one of the Krause kids who was about 6, and he says, "I need you to take him over to Galax." And so they walked to Galax. A black kid and a white kid walked all the way over to Galax from where this was.
Oh,
And I'm thinking, that's such a fascinating story of which kind of belies all this stuff that makes everything so simple. It's very much more complex. And that family is buried right next to my family there in that
oh
graveyard.
wow. Oh, how interesting.
I think that's part of, maybe we could say it this way, it's part of the rural culture of these old places that subsistence life was more difficult, and therefore you didn't have the luxury of being too prejudicial towards your neighbor. You know, your neighbor is your neighbor.
Right.
You have to take care of each other.
Yeah, yeah. My friend Carrie Lee Merritt wrote this brilliant book called Masterless Men, and it is
Ah,
very much about these, poor whites, these subsistence farmers in the hills of Appalachia. Also how they, tremendously benefited from emancipation. But yeah, that it was, yeah, they were very much subsistence farmers who, had to rely on their tiny little communities and their hollers.
so let me ask you one last question. Um, I could talk with you all day, so because I really love all this, and so many stories to tell. What is your hope for the field of history um, going forward as we're in this time of global change? I mean,
Right.
I'm guessing that history has a role that's far greater than maybe it's ever been, but I'd like to know what you think.
Um, Yeah, I mean, right now, we're definitely in a period where I just hope that on a basic level, I hope, I can continue to teach things like women's history, like African American history, and, be able to, tell these stories because, it's impossible to tell, all the amazing stories there are to tell in, US 1 and 2 surveys. Um, but, to be able to continue to highlight, the diversity of history, the nuances of history. And, there's a saying that, if history is not making you uncomfortable, then, you're probably not learning it correctly. And so, the fact that sometimes, after particularly, a hard lesson, come home and, pour a glass of wine and be like, ugh, that was a hard day teaching because you have to teach some really difficult things at times that make people uncomfortable. And I think that is, probably one of the most important aspects of it is that, the past is not always pretty. It's definitely not areas, that you want to go back to. And so, just to be able to keep doing it, accurately and freely, really.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you, and um, I think it's also true with what William Faulkner said, which is the past isn't past. The past is not dead. It's not even past.
Right,
It lives
right.
with us um, every day, and the more you know. your history and and from a diverse perspective of history, the better able you are to make sense of what's happening in the moment that we are in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, well, I thank you for giving me some time today, and I've enjoyed this very
Thank
much. I hope it's
you.
been fun for you. And uh,
Yes,
um, you said you've written a book, is that right?
I have. I do have it here. It is called The Life of Elreta Melton Alexander. It's through the University of Georgia Press. Yeah, and it is a really wonderful story about a remarkable woman who accomplished not so much I mean, professionally and during the civil rights movement, but who also had a really interesting and at times tragic personal life and how she's able to, do accomplish everything that she did when, personal and societal odds were stacked against her. And her family also, her ancestors were from the Great Dismal Swamp area of North Carolina. And so she came out of this tradition of, the triracial people that kind of, the marooned slaves and the remnants of the Tuscaroras and poor whites in that area.
Yeah.
Um, to tell a really fascinating story.
Wrap your head around that context.
Yeah.
That's significant. Well, we'll put whatever you want in the show notes, and we'll certainly point people to where they can find your book because that sounds like a great one to read.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, and I look forward to
Thank
talking
you.
to you again. And we'll see you down at the coffee shop.
Sounds good. Thank
Okay.
you so much for having me.
And thank you everyone for watching. I hope that this has inspired you to know your own history, to get in touch with it, because it explains a lot if you just allow yourself to see it from the broad scope of what is transpiring where you live and in your own local community. The more you know, I think the better you're able to make decisions which are beneficial to your community. And what better thing to be able to say is happening when you're reading history or living history, as they also could say. So thank you, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.